Hey guys, I'm back with another video. This one is about the Divorce and Remarriage book by Tony Evans. I just made the first one about chapter 1. I didn't go into too much detail because I want you guys to read the book, but it did go over some things that I thought were important that I liked in the book. I said I was going to make some notes in the book, but I forgot to make the notes, and so I wanted to finish this mini series up before I forget or get busy, and I have time right now. So I already read the book, I just didn't make the notes. So let's see if we can remember what things I want to tell you guys before I forget. But let's start by reading the first 2 pages, or at least the first page and a half. So this is part 2. The conditions of divorce. So as mentioned in the first chapter, spiritual death and physical death are 2 conditions for divorce. What other conditions are there for divorce in God's eyes? So let's read about it. So it says, in the midst of Jesus healing people, performing miracles, and encouraging those in need, a group of Pharisees attempted to set him up on an issue of divorce. The stigma and controversy that surrounds divorce today in the church is not much different than that was prevalent in Jewish culture in Jesus' day. Yet, before we delve into their question, I want to paint a picture of the social and religious context within which it was made. Among the Greeks, divorce was no big deal. This is because if you were Greek, you could have as many women as you wanted and still married to one whom you had married. And still be married to the one whom you had married. Yet, if you chose to divorce her, that was an option as well. However, in Jewish culture, divorce was a very big deal. If you wanted another woman, that meant you had to do something with the first one that you had. There were 2 schools of thought among the Jews at the time that had come from 2 of the leading rabbis, Hillel and Shammai. In that day, Hillel would have been considered the liberal. He purported that a person should be able to divorce for any reason at all. This would be similar to what many states today call no-fault divorce. Yet Hillel actually went beyond the no-fault thesis to state that having a bad wife was similar to having leprosy, and that it was a man's duty to get rid of her. If she was a bad cook, then the man was to replace her with a good cook. If she wasn't good looking, the man replaced her with someone who was beautiful. You can imagine the kind of atmosphere that this created among Jewish women at the time. Because this is the little expert that they have here. It says, because people have a distorted and a low view of marriage, divorce is an easy option. So this is the first page and a half of the conditions for divorce. So I want to discuss what I thought about that first little part, which is interesting. Some people do feel like they can get divorced for anything. Anything at all. They don't like I think that what's crazy is they said if your wife is ugly, get a beautiful wife. But I imagine if she's ugly when you marry her, that she was ugly before you married her, and you didn't really have to marry her, so you're just getting divorced for stupid reasons. But yeah, in my view, I've always thought I wouldn't get divorced for anything. When I got married, I would stay married. I told my husband before we got married, hey, we should go to counseling if we feel like we want to get married. We should talk. We should try every option before we even consider divorce. Divorce isn't an option. And he didn't really say anything to that. He just said that we didn't need counseling because he's a pastor, and he could counsel us. But clearly that hasn't worked. But I can't talk about my divorce or my pending divorce on here. So I'm not going to talk about that. But I just think that's crazy. Get divorced for anything. If she can't cook, get divorced. That's crazy. But I know some people that think like that. I do. And they're not from this country. They think like that. Get a new one every time it doesn't work. Instead of trying to make it work out, get a new one. And to a certain extent, I think like that, but not for divorce. For something more simple, like you don't like your car, get a new one. But not for a spouse. A spouse is a vow that you made to one person out of your whole life, and you can't just replace them like that. You said till death do you part. I believe you should keep that thing. You don't make vows to cars, so you get a new one. You don't make vows to schools, so get a new one. Or change your school if you don't like it. But if you make a vow, I feel like you should stay with that vow. But that's just me. So I'm gonna move on. I'm trying to do this with one hand, and my son's laying on me, so I can't really get into the position to hold the book correctly. And sorry if my eyes are watering. I've been thinking about some stuff, and I'm also a little sleepy, so my eyes are gonna water a little bit, and it's gonna look like I'm crying, but I'm not really crying. It's just my eyes are watering. So let's fast forward in the book. I'm not gonna read this whole section, but I do want to go over some things. So let's see. Okay, so I'm on page 28. It says, now here's where we start getting to the issue of divorce. It was obvious, even in the days of Moses and God's ideal for marriage was not always being realized because of human sin. For allowance had to be made to retain social order and to protect against injustices towards people. But it needed to be made on God's terms, not man's. Here is an important distinction that many people don't grasp. Look at the exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees in verse 7 through 8 of Matthew chapter 19. Remember, the question on the floor is whether a man can divorce his wife for any cause. They said to him, Why then did Moses command, give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way. Sorry, I'm a little congested when I talk. I'm not sure why. Notice that the very different words that the Pharisees and Jesus used to describe divorce. They called it a command, implying that it was something that they had to do, something Moses was making them do. But Jesus set them straight right away by saying that it was a permission, a concession because of sin, not a command. It was a concession of a legal document intended to protect social order. Should a woman be given a bill of divorce given a bill of divorce and that her previous husband cannot go back and marry her again if she married another. It was also meant to protect people from misuse or abuse in unjust situations. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 through 4. God never commands divorce, but because of sin, God sometimes permits it. And this is what I was talking about. He permits divorce. Hold on. Sorry, I had to swallow my mute because all of a sudden I'm congested, which is crazy. When I talk about God, I'm congested. When I talk about sin or something not God related, I'm not congested, which is crazy. Anyway, so we're on page 29. It says, God never commands divorce, but because of sin, God sometimes permits it. That's a fundamental distinction. God never tells you that you have to get divorced, but there are certain situations in which God will permit people the option of getting divorced because of their sinfulness and hard hearts that misuse to yield to his authority. There were several reasons for the certificate of divorce mentioned here. It was a document showing that the divorce had been granted legally. These are still issued today, although much too easily. But the idea is that if you got married legally, you had to get divorced legally. The divorce certificate also provided a way to protect the innocent from the effects of sin. Protection became an important factor there. Even in the garden, when God divorced himself from Adam and Eve and removed them, it was to protect his holiness and prevent them from getting to the tree of life in their sinful condition. And you can see here that they're saying sin is a condition, kind of like a sickness, which is interesting. I thought that was interesting when I read it the first time. The certificate of divorce was the only way women in biblical times could be protected. Women could easily be abused without the certificate because it made certain provisions for them. Hold on, guys. I'm going to shift or try to shift with my son on my lap. Hold on. Once again, my eyes are watering. I'm not crying. Otherwise, if a man could just throw his wife out of the house because he wanted to, she and perhaps even the children might be put on the streets. If divorce was legally established, then it had to be obtained legally. Sorry, guys. Okay, so I'm going to read a little more just because I put a sticky note here and I want you guys to see it because I thought it was important. Okay, the Pharisees tried to trick Jesus with a little word switch here, but of course it didn't work. He reminded them that God only permitted divorce. He did not command it under Moses, and he has not commanded it today. So the question is, when is divorce permissible? So what are the conditions of divorce? So the question becomes, under what circumstances does God permit divorce? Jesus addresses this in verse 9. And I say to you, whomever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Therefore, a permissible bias is for divorce is immorality by one of the parties in the marriage. Notice, though that Jesus says that if you get divorced for an illegitimate reason, then go out and marry someone else. Hold on, I have my sticky note here. Okay, he says, notice that Jesus says that if you get divorced for illegitimate reason, then go out and marry someone else, you commit adultery. Why? Because in God's economy, you are still married to the person you thought you divorced, which I thought was interesting. So even if you think you got divorced, you're still married. Why? He's going to discuss that here. How do you know if a possible divorce is biblically permissible? As well as we'll see later. God has given the church authority to rule in cases like this. No believer should head downtown to divorce a court until he or she has brought his or her case to the church for determination of the facts and a ruling, which is what I'm doing now. I'm trying to get a counseling session with my pastor to see if my divorce is permissible biblically. Now, if the church finds no grounds for divorce, the person might still choose to go ahead and get a divorce downtown, but they do so at their own spiritual peril. And that's why I put the sticky note there. I thought that was something important that we should know, that nowadays there's no Moses to go to ask, hey, can we get a certificate for divorce? But we are the church. God allowed us, and this is from a Christian's perspective. If you're not a Christian, you may not understand this, nor may you care. But from a Christian's perspective, we have authority over us. Our husband's supposed to be the authority of the wife, but if you try and separate from your husband, or you try to separate from your wife, the next authority above that is the church. So you have to go to the church to see, biblically, do we have grounds for divorce? Once again, the grounds for divorce are spiritual death, physical death, and, as Jesus said, immorality. So if you're cheating, whether that be with yourself, I would think through masturbation, or cheating through thoughts of having adultery with someone, or cheating physically, that's immorality and sin. So let's continue to the next page, which is page 31. It says, that's because, as far as God is concerned, a person who divorces with no legitimate grounds is still married to his or her first partner, which I thought was really interesting. That's why I had to make sure that my divorce is grounds for a biblical divorce, so that I won't still be married once I get divorced. So if the person remarries on the word of the judge downtown and not the word of the judge uptown, which is uptown is heaven and in heavenly realms, and downtown is on earth, he or she now has two living mates, which I didn't want to have if I got remarried. And the more illegitimate divorces and remarriages, the greater the number of living mates is in existence. Keep in mind that sexual immorality in its many forms was a capital crime in the Old Testament. Leviticus 18, verse 1 through 3. This was considered to be true in Jesus' day, as we know from the story of the woman caught in adultery, John chapter 8, verse 1 through 11. Immorality is a very serious offense. The issue of sex is really theological, not biological. But why did Jesus mention immorality as a permissible grounds for divorce? Because according to 1 Corinthians 6, verse 15 through 16, when you have sexual intercourse with another person, you create an illegitimate covenant. I thought this one was interesting too, because I didn't know about the illegitimate covenants. Do you know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take away the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? May it never be. Or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? For he says, the two shall become one. Now, I thought this was great. Like, I was really into this. I was really into it. Because I didn't know all this stuff. So, before I got married, I had illegitimate husbands. I had illegitimate covenants with people because I had sex with people that weren't my husband. Surprise! Like, they tell you not to have sex before you're married, but they don't tell you why, and this is why they should tell people stuff. But now, if you get divorced in your eyes, but not divorced in God's eyes, then you're having illegitimate covenants with people, and that's sin. Didn't know that. So I'm going to finish up this page, and then we're going to move on to other things. Notice that Paul uses the language of marriage in verse 16 to describe what happens when a man and woman engage in sex. Now, if a couple having sexual relations are already married to someone else, their immorality has created a rival covenant to the marriage covenant. If the person who does this is unrepentant, that gives the offended party in their marriage grounds for divorce. Let me say again, though, that even in extreme cases like this, divorce is not required. It is not God's original design for marriage. It is only a concession because of sin. What? Come on, guys. Man. So the issue of sex is really theological, not biological. It has to do with establishing a covenant. Look at what look at what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 verse 31 to 32. It was said, "Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of marriage. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of unchastity makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman divorced commits adultery." Here we have what is called a hot mess. A man divorces his wife, although the same truth applies the other way around. For some reason, we'll call this irreconcilable differences. The man then marries someone else, but according to Matthew 19, he says just committed adultery, because in God's eyes, he is still married to his first wife. But now it gets really messy. The wife who is divorced marries another man, so she commits adultery. But in Matthew 5, she is not blamed. The husband is blamed for putting her in that situation. So he causes his ex-wife to commit adultery. But the other man and woman who married these two former married partners are committing adultery because they are marrying people who are still married to someone else in God's sight. Now let me tell you, this whole thing was like, whoa! I feel like I missed so much. Like, there's so much people should tell you before you get married about having sex in illegitimate covenants. And then getting into covenant, I feel like somebody should have said something. And then getting out of a covenant, somebody should have said something. Like, this book describes it all. It's great. But we're not going to stay in this chapter. I just want to discuss that. Fast forward, there's something else that I wanted to discuss legitimate ways for divorce, reasons for divorce, and that's abandonment. If you're abandoned or neglected by your spouse, that's one of them. Or abuse. Abuse is abandonment, because you're supposed to love your wife like Christ loved the church, and if you're not doing that, it's abandonment or neglect. Once again, God does not command divorce. He permits it. That's something you need to know. I wish I put notes in here because there's some good stuff in here. Okay, so let's summarize these three realms where divorce is permissible, each involving some level of spiritual death. I told you spiritual death is one of the reasons why you can get divorced, because if somebody is physically dead, of course you can get divorced, but if somebody's spiritually dead, you can also get divorced. So what is spiritual death? What are the levels of spiritual death? So when a mate enters an illegitimate covenant by committing immorality with another person, or persists in any other form of immorality. So that means if somebody cheats on you, sleeps with someone else, that's immorality. Also, if they have sex with anyone besides their spouse, so that's even themselves, as in a masturbation, that's immorality. Any sexual acts outside of the marriage covenant is immorality, which I didn't know. Also, a level of spiritual death is when a Christian is abandoned by a non-Christian. So if you're married to a non-Christian, they abandon you, that's spiritual death, because they weren't a Christian, so they're already dead spiritually. When a Christian is leaving a realm of spiritual death through unrepentant spiritual rebellion, and it has been unofficially recognized by the church, so that this person's mate declared illegible. I want to say, okay, this word gets me. Illegible for a certificate of divorce. Eligible. Why am I saying it weird? Eligible for a certificate of divorce. So if you go to a church and they say, yeah, this is grounds for divorce, biblically, that's spiritual death, and therefore can you get divorced. If someone cheats on you, spiritual divorce, you can you can get divorced. And then if somebody abandons you, specifically a non-believer abandons you, you can have grounds for spiritual divorce. I'll read this last paragraph and then we're gonna shut it down for this video. There is a reality that is often overlooked that is addressed in spiritual death in scripture that doesn't fall within having grounds for divorce. And by the way, this is page 40, with which Paul recognized in 1 Corinthians as something that occurs. His instruction makes it clear what God's allowable paths are in the situation involving a marriage that has ended without grounds for divorce. I'm going to read this last paragraph. I know I just said I was going to stop, but I'm not done yet. In this passage, God recognizes that for various reasons, people are not able to effectively live together and thus separate and get divorced without biblical grounds. Yet, in these situations, they are either seeking reconciliation or remain unmarried until or unless either spouse enters into a physical relationship with another person. Those are the only two options we read. But to the married I have instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled with her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. 1 Corinthians 7:10-11. Divorce is never the option of choice. It should always be the last case scenario. Yet, knowing the hardness of the human hearts, God has given guidelines pertaining to different divorce situations to show how best to honor Him and keep one's heart pure. Sometimes people whom I counsel are not in any of these categories with biblical grounds. They get divorced without biblical grounds, have since gotten remarried, and are now unable to go back and correct the mess that has been created. The question is always asked of me in these situations, what can be done when things are so threaded, wound up, and messed up that there does not seem to be any way to unravel it and get it back to where it should have been. In these times, all you can do is repent for what you have done right where you are, and then from that point forward, to live a life of faith and obedience. So what happens if you get married and you're still married to your husband? You repent. That's the answer. You repent. I want to finish out this page just because it's the last page in this chapter. I read a lot of more of this chapter than I thought I would, but I really like this chapter. Okay. Yet in divorce cases with biblical grounds, the job of the church, as well as we will see, is to serve as God's court. Before going downtown to get a piece of paper, believers are to submit their cases to church. And if the case is extreme enough to make divorce permissible, the church can issue a certificate of divorce that is recognized by God based on a recognition by the church. Then the person has the freedom to make a divorce legal in court. So, like I said, before you go to the court and you get a divorce, you're supposed to, if you're a Christian, go to God first, because God created marriage, so He should be the one to discuss whether or not you get a divorce. and based on biblical principles, are you permitted to get divorced? If you are, then after you go to the church and they say you're permitted to get a divorce because of you meet the biblical grounds for divorce, then you get a divorce. If you already got remarried without biblical grounds for divorce, you have to repent. And so that's that. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, I would love them. Not a pastor, not a minister. So, I have opinions that are of my own, but I really didn't put too many opinions in this video. I just kind of read the book. But I'm interested in this book. I want to talk about it. So talk about it with me, guys. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye, guys.